chair of the independent inquiry into the Sheffield street tree dispute. Thank you for joining us again. Could you please tell us your name and your role?
Good afternoon, Mark. Darren, I am formerly an employee of Amey as the account director on the Sheffield Streetside project.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much for coming to talk to us today. Just a couple of points to run through that I run through with everyone. This is being live streamed and recorded and will be made available for people to see afterwards. You understand that?
I do.
It's also important for me to say that we can't say anything in these discussions which would be defamatory or libelous or bring into the public domain personal information about somebody that should really be kept public. And I'm sure we won't run into that problem, but were I to be concerned about that, I would flag to you I was concerned, and if we couldn't resolve the issue in extremis, we'd have to curtail the hearing, just to make sure you understand that as well. Great. So I'd just like to start by asking you if you could explain your background and roles on Streets Ahead working for Amey LG, and also just clarify the basis on which you're talking to us today, because you don't work for Amey anymore, and I'd just like to be clear on the basis on which you're talking to us today.
Yes, I'm a former employee of Amey, as you're aware, so I left in January 21. So Amey, obviously in my original terms and conditions of employment, I would have signed a confidentiality agreement. Amey are happy for me to speak freely today to assist the inquiry in any matters that I can. My background, I actually had 2 periods of employment with Amey. I started in October 2007 and concluded my first period in, I think it's December 2010. I was involved as a senior landscape manager on a portfolio of numerous contracts across the local government for Amey, and also supported them on a number of bids, and one of those bids being the initial bid for Sheffield. I was responsible for the operational solution on Service Standard 6, grounds maintenance, which included trees. And then I left Amey for a couple of years and came back to them in August 2012 as the Principal Ops Manager responsible for street scenes. So that encompassed street cleansing, grounds maintenance, again, which included the trees. And in 2014 became the Operations Director, responsible for all the operational maintenance within the project, from street cleansing, grounds, highways, drainage, and everything else within the portfolio, with the exception of the core investment period. And in, I think it was January 2018, was appointed the Account Director with overall responsibility for the project.
Great, thank you very much indeed. And just to be clear, in case anybody out there is worried, you haven't signed any non-disclosure agreement or anything like that which affects what you can tell us today?
No, I haven't.
Yeah, very good. Thank you very much indeed. Well, let me start by asking you the sort of standing back, thinking about the history type project and inviting you to take advantage of the benefit of hindsight. And just talk to us a bit about what you now think might have been done differently in the design stage, including in the approach to, and in fact the phasing of, the tree replacement programme.
I think we have to go back quite a substantial period, going back 15 years when the contract was being bid. It was predominantly looking at the hard surface in terms of renewal of the highways, the footways and street lighting project predominantly. Trees weren't a prominent factor in the bid. They were there as a highway asset to be maintained and obviously replaced where necessary. But they weren't that prominent. And in all the dialogues that were in the early stages of that bid I was involved in, they didn't feature heavily. I think today it would be the opposite. I think the green estate and the green infrastructure would be very prominent in any contract now. So I think the inflexibility around the trees and within the contract, 752 performance requirements that we had to manage to and comply with, I think there'll be a greater focus now with the climate emergency and everything else we have to look at the tree replacement in a different way, in terms of a greater phasing of the replacement programme, but also perhaps a greater number of replacement trees to the one being removed. With the climate emergency and the loss of the canopy of mature trees, I think everyone would focus now on, is a one-for-one replacement sufficient? I think the other area would be around communications. Obviously the whole contract again, going back to the performance requirements, was very rigid. There was no flexibility around communication, so everything was for a centralised and through the authority. I think a greater mutual strategy that we could work towards would have given the opportunity to be more reactionary and get greater information out into the public domain at earlier stages, I think. So I think the inflexibility, the prominence of trees and the green infrastructure, and then communications would be the key areas for me.
Okay, thank you. Would it be fair to say that you didn't anticipate or hadn't identified the risk, and others hadn't in Amey either, of a significant dispute arising that wasn't anticipated during the design phase?
There was certainly no discussion around a campaign that obviously resulted in relation to trees and wasn't considered by any party at that time.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, I was involved in the bid at the early period, but certainly when I rejoined in 2012 and when work started, no one envisaged the outpouring of concern around the tree replacement programme.
Right. And do you think that anything could have been done? Could any different questions have been asked of any different people in the period up to 2012 that might have drawn attention to the risks that were in fact there and weren't well enough identified?
I think it's very difficult in hindsight. Obviously, in hindsight, yes, there's plenty of questions that could have been asked of everybody in terms of the impact the tree replacement programme is going to have, the timing of that programme, particularly up front, those first 5 years, because there had been such a lack of investment over many years by the authority in the tree stock and obviously the highways as well. So there was huge potential for risk, but the focus always was around the highway and making sure that we didn't grind the city to a halt in our works, which we delivered very successfully. We delivered a huge programme of improvement works on the highways and street lighting without bringing the city to a stop. And that's really where the focus was. It was all around the highway and the highway asset.
I do understand that that's where the focus was, but I do wonder, had there been a slightly different focus and different questions been asked at that stage, it might have been possible to have forestalled some of the problems that arose. For example, would it surprise you, or did you know, or is it news to you that a number of people have said to me, these are business leaders, representatives of trade unions, some middle managers in the council have said to me that they said in 2012 the tree elements of this in parts of the city are going to be a problem?
I don't recall any of those conversations, Mark. If it was up to 2012, obviously I wasn't employed at that time.
No.
Joining in 2012, we got straight on with the works. Those conversations weren't really coming in, and the programme was very delivered successfully.
Right.
Amey was there, progressing with the highways, the street lighting, and the tree replacements. So it didn't come up.
Okay, thank you. So when did you first form the view that actually there were some significant objections to the tree replacement programme, and what were your sort of initial attempts to understand the concerns?
So when we first started it in August 12, we initially carried out the survey of the tree assets, obviously to try and identify the condition of the tree population. That identified a number of trees that were dead, dying, diseased that needed to be replaced. And it was really only after August we started those walk and build processes around the highways. So we're identifying trees damaging the infrastructure. My colleagues and myself were out doing tree walks with residents and other groups. And there's a real Marmite factor as well. We had residents that loved them and others that hated them and wanted more trees taken out. But we spent a considerable amount of time with people engaging with them in terms of the trees to be replaced, why they were being replaced, and the replacement species that were going in. And we did show some flexibility around those replacement species as well to try and make sure that we brought people on the journey with us. We could see there was some concerns around the replacement, so we did a tree forum where we brought people with, not a tree forum, but a tree event where we brought people to Ecclesfield Woods to show them the skills of the arborists involved, The sort of surveys that we were doing and trying to educate people in the way that the team were operating, who were exceptional at the time. And we also had an ecologist there from our Amey consulting team who were, was identifying the sort of environmental assessments they were doing as well. And it was just an open forum for members of the public, members of the council and others to come and talk to us and understand the programme. We also held road shows ahead of any of the core investment works. Again, members of the public would come in and raise concerns and want to understand the works and the sequence of works that we're delivering. And to be fair, for the first couple of years, they were very successful. And we spent an awful lot of time doing tree walks and trying to get people engaged. But, like I say, as the programme went on, we could see there was greater concern in some areas of the city. And I think, to be fair, Rustlins Road really emphasised and really became a bit of a watershed for us. We identified the trees to be replaced, I think it was in 2015, and it was 18 months later almost, when the actual trees were replaced, or removed and then replaced.
So, to summarise what you said, to check I've understood it correctly, in 2012, 2013, 2014, you were not seeing a build-up of public concern and opposition to what was happening?
No, we weren't. What we were seeing is individuals within streets raising some concerns, but as I said, there were other residents equally asking us to do more.
Yeah.
So, we would quite often have streets where we were telling people, no, we weren't felling more trees, we were just replacing the ones identified only.
But by 2015, things were starting to change?
Yes, they were.
Right.
Yes.
Okay.
Sorry, if I can just go back. So, but also at that same time, there was other projects, new works being delivered by the team, not associated with the PFI necessarily, but that did raise some concerns because there were some tree replacements as part of that programme.
Healy City Farm, you're referring to?
That's right, our non-core activities, which obviously raised some concerns. Obviously, there was Dave Dillon heavily involved in the Mearsbrook Bus scheme, for instance,
right.
And we also had Meadowhead roundabout,
right.
And that started to focus people's minds around what was happening around the city.
Okay. Thank you for that. That's helpful. I want to ask you a few things now about the independent tree panel. Could you firstly just describe to us Amey's involvement in providing information to the independent tree panel? So
all the trees identified for replacement by Amey were submitted to the authority for approval. So I think it was in late 2015, I think the ITP was formed. The works at that point, then the replacement programme was suspended whilst the ITP considered those replacements. Amey had provided obviously the reasons for those trees to be replaced to the authority, and all that information obviously passed over to the ITP. I won't go into the ITP process because that's Andy Buck has already been in, I believe, and seen you, so he knows the system far better than I do. We provided very little information in relation to the ITP. We did a presentation, I think it was in late or mid 2016, August 2016 I recall, that just highlighted what the contract was about, the performance requirements we had to adhere to, and the street strategy that we were operating to at that time.
Okay.
But very little information other than that.
Okay. But you recall a session with the ITP where you provided them with information?
That's right, yes. There's the presentation around the contract and yes.
Right. Could you then go on to the question of Amey's involvement in deciding what should happen in response to recommendations made by the ITP?
Amey weren't involved in that decision, to be fair. It was purely with the authority. So it was just part of the approval process. It was almost an extended approval process. The trees had already been approved for replacement. Those replacement approvals, if you like, have been suspended whilst the ITP reviewed and came up with their recommendations. Those recommendations were then fed to the authority, and the authority made a decision, either releasing the trees back to us to progress with the replacement programme or remove them from the programme.
Okay, so you were simply the recipients of information from the council on what they had decided to do in response to the ITP recommendation?
Yes, correct.
Yes. In a number of cases, the council decided to proceed with what it had previously planned to do, and you, that I'm deducing therefore, just got on to do that.
Yes, they released them back to us and authorised us to then proceed with the replacement programme.
But in other cases, a relatively small number of cases proportionately, the council agreed with a different recommendation from the ITP, and I just wonder, and that meant that it was referred back to you with a different course of action. And I just wonder if you remember occasions where there was a discussion between your colleagues in Amey or you and people in the council on that different course of action.
I don't recall, to be fair, many conversations at all around those different courses of actions. There was an awful lot going on at the time, Mark, in terms of delivering the overall contract as well as the trees. Trees were and remain a very small part of the overall project. But I understand, Amey were making. Amey weren't able to progress the tree works until they were released.
Right.
Upon their release, we then were asked to progress the programme. Those trees that were released that were where the replacement approval was removed, obviously we acted accordingly.
Right. Okay. Thank you for that. That's clear answers on the things I wanted to ask you about on your involvement with the ITP. So thank you. So moving on, could you just run through for us the people who, on a day-to-day basis, you most engage with in the council in 2016 and thereafter?
Obviously, I started in 2012 as the Principal Ops Manager, so a lot of my involvement from that point was with the technical officers within the authority. Obviously, as my career progressed, I took more of a leadership role within the project. So, I was attending the operational board meetings, management board meetings subsequently as well. These are on a monthly cycle, so there would be the lead, the lead within the highways, performance and commercial team within the authority. Lastly, after 2016, as the campaign escalated, yes, I got involved more with representatives from the legal team and the political leadership as well within the authority.
So on a day-to-day basis, from 2016, who were the people you were most commonly talking to?
The key people would have been the head of highways and head of performance and commercial.
And they just remind me who the people filling those roles were?
So at one point you had Steve Robinson, up until the point he departed the authority, Phil Beecroft, and then also in the senior leadership within the authority, Paul Billington. Right,
okay. Thank you. I'll come on to other people you got drawn into discussions with in a minute, but let me firstly ask you if you could describe for us Amey's role or your involvement really in the planning for the operation that happened on Russlings Road in November 2016, but in particular the division of responsibilities as you understood it between you, the council and the police.
I think we had to go back to a bit earlier with Russlings Road. So Russlings Road, as we said, was identified quite early in the programme in 2015. And, there was a considerable amount of work over the subsequent 12, 18 months before the actual works were undertaken. So, we'd undertaken investigation works on the site. Obviously the ITP had also investigated and looked at the trees on Russlings Road. And it's only upon those trees being released from the authority to us to progress, that no alternatives were acceptable, that we then had to consider how we were going to deliver the works operationally. So to deliver those works operationally and safely, which obviously was paramount to us in Amey, was through the involvement of Sheffield City Council and South Yorkshire Police. We came up with the operational plan that we instigated in November 2016, which was to deliver the works outside of the core hours and deliver them swiftly to minimise disruption on the street and the opportunity for people congregating and the risk of harm. Fundamentally what we wanted to do is make sure the works got done safely.
So for how long did it take for that operational plan to be put in place? Is it fair to say that the planning took a number of months.
It did. It did. And the dates, kept changing because we had to consider the police resources as well as our own, and we had to consider, any events around the city because ultimately we were looking to close the road.
Yeah. And there's an issue about who legally and in other ways was entitled or should do what as part of the operation. So what were the particular things that the council had to do?
So quickly for the council, obviously, to ensure that we could close the road was fundamentally one of the key areas because obviously we couldn't work safely with the road open to traffic. So the road had to be closed. And obviously around the communications as well. Obviously we operated under, for like a centralised communications protocols because obviously through our performance requirements, all our communications were sent through the authority and had to be authorised by them. So there was the communications and then there was the road closure fundamentally. The actual operational delivery was for Amey.
Who was responsible for removing vehicles from the road?
The removal of vehicles obviously sits with the authorities, parking services.
So that was the council responsible.
Absolutely.
As you may be aware, I've heard in other evidence that the role of the police was to advise, essentially. Is that a fair way of describing the role of the police?
I think that's a fair way, but also, it's about keeping the peace as well, making sure people were safe on the street.
Okay. I want to ask you about the role Amey played at a number of points in trying to find ways to resolve the dispute. So since we're at the moment on 2016, do you recall what Amey did in 2016 to encourage the council to look at options for resolving the dispute?
You have to remember the ITP is running alongside this point as well and making recommendations. So, and Amey did make some recommendations that alternative solutions could be put in place, similar to what the ITP were recommending as well.
Anything else in 2016 you recall?
Not that I recall. There was lots of conversations around trying to seek alternatives to the programme because we could see things were escalating.
Right.
And it wasn't good for anybody's reputation to be in the position we were in. It was an extremely challenging environment to be in.
Okay. And you were aware that there was a discussion going on a refinancing of the contract, which would require a agreement on a variation to the original contract. You were aware of that?
Yes, I was, yeah.
And by definition, if there was a discussion of a variation to the contract going on, it was conceptually feasible to look at things other than the refinancing as part of that variation. And in fact, one or two other things were addressed in that adjustment to the contract in 2016. You're aware of all that?
I am aware of that. Obviously, right from the outset, if you like, of the contract going live. In 2013, we were in discussions around efficiency savings. The authority had budgetary constraints, and Amey worked extremely well and effectively with the authority to identify some savings. And those variations were put through at that same time, or clarified in that same deal. The key is the authority was still looking to deliver the outcomes of the PFI contract, the investment in the highway and bringing that highway up to a good standard there for the future generations as well. And obviously the inward investment that would bring to Sheffield City.
So at that point, what you were hearing, if I've understood what you've just said correctly, from the council was, we're not in the market for any discussion of any kind of different approach, which would, in even a limited number of areas, have involved a slight compromise on the engineering standards.
Not at that time. Obviously, they were extremely mindful as well of why they got the credits for the highway contract as well from DFT. They wanted to deliver the highway to a good standard, and at that point weren't looking to compromise on those standards. Right.
As you know, things evolved further in early 2017, where the council started to moot the idea of taking out injunction against campaigners and protesters. What do you recall of discussion inside Amey about that idea?
I think you had to go slightly back on that a bit, Mark. The Amey put in place safety zones. You know, obviously the arborists and the people working on the project at the time want to ensure that the works were delivered safely, and we didn't. There was no harm to members of the public or to themselves in the carrying out of those duties. And Amey had a Target Zero approach when it came to health and safety. So we always established safety zones on the streets, and those safety zones were being breached at the point by the campaign. There was nothing in place to prevent anyone entering those safety zones, so it is putting themselves and my teams effectively at risk. So that's why the injunction was considered, and the authority took that approach, is to try and maintain the integrity of that safety zone.
Okay, I think you're aware that, in fact I know you're aware that Amey have provided me with a lot of detailed information, including an important memorandum, which touches on this point. I just want to ask you to refresh your memory of a couple of paragraphs of it so we can discuss it. So my first question relates to paragraph 711(1) in the memorandum. Now this is a paragraph which relates to the Council's proposal to seek to obtain an injunction to restrict protester action. And there's a statement here that Amey didn't join the Council in this action, quote, preferring instead to find alternative practical remedies to both legal actions and heightened protester activity. So I wanted just to ask if you recall what particular alternatives Amey were proposing then, or had in mind then.
Our highways team had proposed similar remedies to what the ITP had put forward. So that would have resolved a number of issues around the trees.
Right.
There was an associated cost to that, which the authority at that point didn't think was affordable. And obviously again wouldn't deliver the outcomes of the PFI in terms of the highway. So, but Amey were reluctant to join equally on the injunction. It was considered that, Sheffield City Council are the highways authority. So, any litigation or action should sit with the authority and not with Amey.
Do you remember any discussions, either just inside Amey or with the Council, about whether this idea of taking out injunctions and then being willing to pursue them to committal proceedings would, as a practical matter, have the effect of sufficiently deterring the protesters that there would stop being any interference with the implementation of the programme?
I think there was a genuine belief in the authority that, yes, the integrity of the safety zone would be maintained by having the injunction in place.
And the authority failed to anticipate what in fact happened, in that the campaigners turned out to be creative in finding ways around the injunction and also determined and resilient in resisting what was happening.
The campaigners were phenomenal in terms of finding ways around it and the actions they took, and they were extremely effective.
But my point
I don't
is
think it was envisaged by the
right.
authority.
So my point is that the authority signally failed to adequately assess the likely reaction of campaigners and protesters to what it was planning to do.
Absolutely, I think yes, there was a misperception there that they believed that the injunction would be effective. Like I say, maintain the integrity of the safety zone to allow the programme to continue. One of the failures there was really the injunction did not cover adjacent properties. So by standing on a wall or standing in someone's garden, effectively prevented the works from going ahead, because you can't work aloft above another property when people are standing in close proximity to the tree.
Yeah.
And at all times our crews work safely to try and prevent harm to others.
And just explain to us why the injunction didn't cover adjacent properties.
The authority don't have the authority there to cover third-party property. It was effectively on highway land only.
Yes, and authority presumably judged that there might not be sufficient agreement from the other landowners to signing up with the authority to that kind of injunction.
Well, to be fair, you couldn't expect every household in Sheffield to sign up to that sort of agreement, could you?
Right.
Many of the households would have been, supporting the tree campaigners at the time.
Indeed. So the whole construct was flawed in the sense that it would be very difficult to, as you just said, put in place safety zones adequate to do what you needed to do.
There are, certain areas around the city and certain trees around the city where, that constructing that safety zone allowed the works to progress because of their proximity to adjacent properties meant that we could progress the works without, the tree overhanging adjacent properties and therefore putting others at risk. But yes, a considerable amount of the trees did overhang other properties.
Right.
So it would have been difficult.
Right. Thank you very much. That's very clear. I want to come on now to asking you a bit about your interaction and meetings you were at with political leadership and senior executives of the council, basically from 2017 to early 2018. And the reason I ask this is partly in reference to paragraph 712(1) in the document in front of you, where it states that local political pressure to remove as many of the remaining trees as possible also increased. Regular meetings were held with Sheffield City Council's political leadership where this position was regularly emphasised. And I wanted just to get a bit more of a flavour of meetings you recall and were in and the nature of the discussion.
There are a number of meetings that I attended with the executive of the authority and the political leadership. I think it's fair to say the conversation was extremely robust and there was a desire to get the programme moving and wanted us to do more.
So let's explore what extremely robust means in a bit more detail. Were these meetings cordial, friendly, professional, the kinds of meetings that would be the most common sort of meeting of a business nature that you had experience of? Or were they, on the other hand, meetings with a slightly darker tone and complexion and with different kind of language being used?
My background is contracting, Mark. My entire career I've been contracting. So these conversations were frank, to the point, and they wanted the outcome and they wanted the programme to be progressed.
Right. Okay. Thank you. So let's move on now to the limitations that Amey faced in seeking, as your evidence, or the Amey's evidence tells me the company did, to persuade the council to adopt an approach which might have led to a negotiated solution, including the issue of concerns that were held in Amey over the penalties the council could impose. And if you could tell us a bit about what the council said to you or others in Amey about how they would try to use those penalties.
So like all PFIs, and Sheffield's no different, we are monitored against our performance on a monthly basis. There are 752 performance requirements. That goes from emptying a street litter bin on time to dealing with customer complaints, the condition indices of the highways and footways, lights in light, and obviously equally in relation to trees as well. Through those performance monitoring measures, the authority had previously taken significant deductions from Amey, i.e. financial penalties, if you like. So there was there was a clear understanding that if the trees weren't removed, we didn't meet our milestones, that significant deductions would be taken, and that was made quite clear to us. You wouldn't take the actions we took lightly.
Right. So what you're saying basically is the company essentially felt heavily pressured, not to say threatened, by the council against the danger of substantial performance penalties to be dragged in the direction of taking more, if you like, draconian measures to deal with the campaigners.
As you can see, through 2016 through to 2018, it escalated in terms of the resources that Amey was having to put in to deliver that programme. And obviously the associated costs. You wouldn't escalate to that point without the risk of huge financial penalties being levied against Amey for lack of performance.
Right. Is it the case that the way the contract worked, the size of the unitary charge grew during the period of the core investment programme up to the point where it reached in principle, subject to deductions for non-performance on various things, it reached the sort of long-term level. But that by the end of 2017, the unitary charge was, if you like, fully unlocked.
Correct. That's correct. Once you'd delivered the core investment period successfully in terms of the street lighting and the highway and footway improvements, yes, the unitary charge then sat at that level.
And that had been done by the end of 2017?
Yeah, well, it was in terms of the highways and footways, yes, we'd achieved that by the end of 2017, and for street lighting in the April of 2018.
Okay. But for highways and footways, it was done and dusted by the end of 2017?
That's correct. Obviously, we'd mitigated the trees at this point through that variation previously discussed in terms of achieving relief on the remaining trees or those sections of the street footway that were affected by those trees still left in from the core investment period.
Okay. I want to also, in relation to this, to ask you a question about the cost of alternative solutions, because the council put into the public domain some quite large numbers on what it would cost to take a different approach in respect of some trees, which would involve saving a number of trees. And I wanted to check whether I'm right in understanding that those costs were basically made up of two things. The first was the financial cost of, which might be small or might be negligible, in fact, of a different engineering approach per se. So if you decided not to put a curbstone in, the likelihood of additional cost is very small. On the other hand, if you did some flexi paving, there was a bit more cost. But there was some financial cost immediately, potentially, in the different choice of engineering solution. But then there was another, and that financial cost was quite well known and easy to identify. There was then another cost which was factored in, which was to do with how accepting a lower standard might affect future maintenance costs. And that second cost was potentially both rather larger, but also a little bit more speculative, because it was a forecast about what might happen in the future.
That's correct. So obviously you have the initial capital cost in terms of delivering the solution, and then you'd have the commuted sum then for the remainder of the contract in terms of maintaining that solution, which if, for example, you put a thin curb in, that thin curb may be kicked out by the tree and the buttress roots in future, and therefore would need to be replaced on a number of occasions over the forthcoming 15 years. So yes, there was a sum put to that.
And am I fair in understanding that the first of those two components is relatively small, and the second potentially could be substantially larger?
I wouldn't say it was substantially larger. There would have been a larger sum. I can't remember some of the sums. I remember some of the sums for the initial capital works, but in terms of the community sum, it depended on the solution. If it's more of a permanent solution in terms of a build-out, for instance, where it's properly constructed, then that community sum would be quite low. But when you're putting in a temporary solution that's going to need greater inspection regime and frequent visits, then that sum could be larger than the initial capital costs, obviously.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thanks for clarifying that. That's helpful. Just tell me a little bit more about how you deduced, and the way the message was conveyed, that if Amey did not take as tough an approach as possible to pursuing the tree replacement programme, the council would become, in a way, more aggressive at seeking to pursue penalties on anything that could be penalised in the contract. How did you gather that understanding?
I think it came through verbally, and obviously an exchange of emails as well at times. Clearly there are performance standards that weren't being met due to the presence of the trees. Those performance standards were highlighted, and then Amey calculated what the associated risk was around those performance standards. We had our own performance team internally, and our commercial team could work out that financial risk to the business.
Do you recall the scale, the month-by-month scale, just order of magnitude of the performance penalties that you were suffering 2016, 2017?
To be honest, I don't recall. They were significant at times.
Very significant.
And we had a very good relationship, and we still maintain a very good relationship with Sheffield City Council. And there was mitigation plans put in place, performance improvement plans where necessary, to ensure that, when it came to deductions, we tried to minimise them at all times, and that was through good dialogue and a good relationship, and some good performance as well by the teams.
Yeah, but there was an overhang of you being aware that the council could ratchet up the pressure on you in terms of performance penalties, and that was part of the backdrop against which the company was, from the evidence you submitted, somewhat reluctantly drawn into more aggressive measures. Is that right?
Absolutely. The financial deductions were a real factor, and a substantial deduction had been taken in previous years. So, the ability.
So it was a real threat.
It was a real threat, and we're alive to that threat.
Yeah. So those things all amounted to essentially limitations in Amey's practical ability to persuade the council to adopt a more varied approach to the handling of trees. Is that?
Yeah, it's fair to say. I think we can make recommendations and suggestions of alternatives, but ultimately, without the authority's approval, we couldn't progress.
Okay. Now, I wonder if you thought that the measures taken to escalate the dispute, for example through the legal action, the introduction of stewards, the use of private security companies, later the use of, quote, reasonable force, end quote, whether you thought, because you actually, Darren, had a very good understanding of you knew a lot of the campaigners and protesters, I wonder whether you thought those things would in fact deter the protesters.
I spent a considerable amount of my time, Mark, although trees were a small proportion of the project, I spent a disproportionate amount of time on them. So many days on the streets, and know the campaigners reasonably well at this point, and we had a good relationship. They were extremely innovative in terms of their approach and being able to cause delay and disruption to the programme. And they were absolutely committed to ensuring those trees would be retained on the streets. So it didn't take much to stop the programme. I was on streets where a slow walk would prevent you from getting on the street. From the geckering and bunnying of protesters along the side of fences or standing in residential properties adjacent, they're very innovative in their approach. So as things escalated, so did the campaigners, right, in terms of their approach to prevent the works happening.
So I wonder if you recall any conversations you had with senior officers in the council where you said to them, look, these people are very determined, they're very creative. Why do you think, oh council officer, that if we take these measures it's going to deter people? Because I'm not sure it is. Do you recall a conversation like that?
I can't remember that specific conversation, Mark. Obviously there was an awful lot going on at the time. It was clear the campaigners were committed to the cause, to retain those trees. It was evident in everything that we were doing that we couldn't progress the programme at any pace.
Right.
And clearly all these images and everything that was happening was seen by the leadership in the authority as well. So the picture was quite bleak in terms of being able to deliver that programme. Yeah,
okay, thank you. Now, I wanted also to ask you if you could say a little bit about the impact on Amey and indeed subcontractors you employed on having to take those actions, because that must have been, I mean, it can't have been easy for you as a senior manager having to ask people to do these things. Could you tell us a little bit about the impact on your staff?
I think it's fair to say it was one of the most difficult periods of my career to date. The teams on a day-to-day basis, not only face the campaigners, and to be fair to the campaigners, they're extremely polite and courteous to our horticultural teams and welcome it. They knew they were there to do a job. So to be fair, there was no real axe to grind with the tree teams, or certainly at the start. Obviously that did progress a little bit later on. But the tree teams obviously did feel, they were Sheffield residents. They were accosted in the local shop or the local pub. I recall, one of our employees running a subsequent campaign was accosted in the pub because of their works and who they worked for and in relation to the project. We did put security protocols, and Amey was extremely concerned about staff and the well-being of staff. We did put a number of programs in place in terms of conflict management and trying to support staff in terms of the stress that they were going through. We had some exceptional staff that worked for Amey, and a number of them transferred over from the authority as well. And we lost staff as a result of the programme. It was extremely stressful for some people, and they couldn't progress, and others just wanted to leave the contract as a result. My own personal experience, and actually the experience of the rest of the team as well, we were on the street at times where there was, obviously you had the campaign and obviously the noise that came from the campaign. But one of the more heart-wrenching days I recall is having the campaigners and residents against each other. And you're stuck in the middle, with residents telling you to get the tree out and campaigners trying to retain the tree. And I recall a protester being harmed by one of the residents, and you don't want to be in that position. I personally had huge respect for the leadership of the campaigners. I met them regularly. They all had my number. If there was an issue, they could ring me. So you didn't want to see that harm, and that was heartbreaking to see. And for my own daughter, she was going to study in Sheffield, but when she went to an open event with the universities and she mentioned her name, they obviously asked her relationship with me, and obviously she the university representative at the time wasn't particularly complimentary, so anyway, she didn't study in Sheffield as a result. But and there's lots of stuff in social media. I wasn't a fan of social media, really, I was still not, but I think my kids and colleagues' kids as well, and families were seeing an awful lot of stuff on social media that was upsetting to them. Probably more so than to myself directly, because obviously I was on the street. I never felt threatened by the campaign, if you like. They were there with a view, and I respected their views, and so I never felt personally threatened, although people on the fringes would threaten you. The actual campaigners were very good and generally very courteous towards me. So, but it was an extremely stressful time, and not one I'd want to revisit again in my future career.
Okay, thanks for that. You've been very open on that. Thank you very much. Now, I know you're aware of a case where there was an employee of a security company who sustained a wrist or arm injury, and it became a little bit of a cause célèbre because there was a belief developed among some of the campaigners that perhaps that wasn't true. Could you please tell us what you're able to tell us about the facts of that case?
So yes, I think it was in early 2018, a campaigner breached the fence, and as a result of breaching that fence, held one of the security stewards' wrists, I recall, and I think as a result of the twist and the compression applied to his wrist, that did cause a fracture. That fracture was reported through to HSE as a riddle, and I think we have provided you a copy of that riddle report.
Right, so there was an injury which justified a reporting incident under the health and safety legislation, a report on injury or...
it was a fracture and the individual was off work, so hence the report made.
And it was duly reported to the HSE, And I mean, I can confirm it is the case that I've had documentation which substantiates that. So thank you very much indeed for that. The next thing I wanted to ask you is a little bit about the role of the police and your interactions with the police.
Well, I think we go all the way back to Ruslands Road, to be fair. That's when we were introduced to SYP, and Sheffield Police were aware of the programme, and obviously then, I wouldn't say supported us, but were there to facilitate some of the works that we were doing. So, obviously, we've already discussed Ruslands Road and their input there. Subsequently, they did get more involved at one point in terms of supporting the programme and allowing us to progress the tree replacements. But when the injunctions were then put in place, I think it's fair to say that South Yorkshire Police did take a bit of a step back, because as far as they're concerned at that point, it has now become a civil action, and it's for the authority to enforce that. Whilst there's still police presence on our sites, they were there really to maintain the peace on site, not necessarily to facilitate the works or aid us in our works, but to ensure that works were carried out peacefully and safely.
Okay. I had a conversation with Mr. Anderson about this next issue I wanted to ask you about earlier on today, but I just wanted to check with you if you recall correspondence with the police in late 2017 about a potential set of new measures that the company was thinking of taking, including the use of reasonable force. Do you recall any of the internal discussions about that in the correspondence?
Yeah, I do. It was critical to ensure that, before we went to the point of reasonable force, that we were acting legally and lawfully.
Yes.
So yes, we were there. We engaged with Sheffield City Council and with the police at all times, and everyone was aware of every step we took as things escalated over that period of time.
Yeah, okay, all right. So, I mean, if there's anything else you'd like to tell me about your memory of that, once you've had a chance to look at what Mr. Anderson told me, I'd be very happy to hear from you. I don't have more questions for you at the moment, but because he was very clear in what he said. But so let's move on. I want to come now to the factors that led to the decision that you took on the 26th of March 2018 to pause the tree removals. There'd been previous pauses, but there were some particular things I think that led you to decide, in the light of what happened on 26th of March 2018, to pause, and in fact the tree replacement programme was never resumed until there was a solution found. Could you please just describe why you did that day?
So if we can go back a little bit again, Mark, so safety zones were integral to make sure we could deliver the programme safely. And as you recalled and as you mentioned, things have escalated. So we escalated to the point of from plastic barriers to Harris fencing, the use of stewards around that fencing to prevent people accessing it. And the campaign is extremely inventive in terms of circumventing them and preventing the programme from progressing. We then went to the use of reasonable force, which, to be fair, was an absolute last resort. No one wanted to see people being physically removed from a safety zone. And I spent more time on site then than any time previously. And I think I talked more people out of those safety zones than people were carried out. We didn't want to see people going through committal hearings, so I made reassurances to individuals before reasonable force was applied to say, come on, if we leave now, there'll be no further proceedings. We just wish to progress to the works. But as the use of reasonable force was put in place, and I think as the campaigners, the resolve was still there to prevent the trees being removed. So tensions were becoming extremely high on site. And I felt that when I was on site, and like I said, I spent an awful lot of time on site. And it got to a point where things escalated to such a point where the programme was not being delivered, and we could no longer deliver the trees. We're turning up with substantial policing, with stewards, we're putting Harris fencing on the street, and we're actually not delivering anything. as a result, because as soon as someone breached it, it would take an awful long time before we put reasonable force in place, before we actually took someone out of that safety zone. So tensions were heightened, and as a result of what happened in March, I decided, and with Amey as well, collaboratively, that we could no longer progress the programme, so we paused the programme. And that pause continued.
Yeah. Now, documentation available to me leads me to understand that, in fact, by early February, the council believed that Amey was willing to take on some additional financial liability to meet some of the costs, in other words, of a different approach. And I just wanted to check if you were aware. I mean, I'm assuming you must have been aware of that, but what I've seen is that the council were aware of that from early February. Do you recall that?
We were talking to the authority about alternative approaches. We were extremely keen to go a different route. We could see that we'd escalated to the point of reasonable force. There was nowhere else to go.
Right.
The number of trees that we were taking out on a daily basis was very, very small.
Right.
The costs were just escalating as well. And there are very few trees that we could effectively deliver going forward, because they either overhung third-party properties or other land that the injunction did not cover. So the possibility of getting some of these trees out was pretty slim. So an alternative had to be sought. So we were in discussions about trying to find alternative solutions, but at the same time under pressure to keep going with the programme.
So the council knew in early 2018 you were willing to meet some of the cost of a different approach, but the council were continuing to pressurise you, and indeed trying to draw the police increasingly into ratcheting up measures to deter the protesters.
The authority were very keen to deliver the outcomes of the PFI and get the highway to a good standard.
But part of the earlier argument the authority used, that it would be financially very damaging for them to adopt a different approach, had been partly at least dealt with by the fact that you were putting a willingness on the table to meet some of those costs.
Yeah, to meet some of the costs, obviously not all the costs, Mark. We were looking to, on specific roads and specific areas, to address some of the situations, but they were limited. It wasn't meeting all the costs for all the solutions.
But in fact, a lot of the things that you were discussing as early, if not before actually, as early February 2018, were the things that were then incorporated into the negotiated solution through the mediation.
Correct.
Right. So one question all that begs is, in addition to what I've just said, another question all that begs is why it wasn't until 26th of March 2018 that you essentially pulled the plug to all intents and purposes. Now, before you answer that question, I want just to tell you, in case you didn't hear it, what Mr. Anderson told me earlier today. Mr. Anderson told me, if I interpreted him, understood him correctly, and he was quite clear about this, and I'll ask my lawyer to tell me if I've got my understanding wrong. I think Mr. Anderson told me that in retrospect, Amey wish they had called a halt to things rather earlier than happened. They wish they'd resisted more energetically what the council wanted, so the thing could have been drawn to a close rather earlier. I wanted just to tell you that's what he told me before you answer the question I put to you.
And I think Mr. Dan's probably correct in what he said as well. I think you have to bear in mind, though, that through 2018, whilst it sounds an insignificant period of time, if you like 3 months, it wasn't. We were, as a matter of weeks that operationally we were delivering within that period. We weren't out every day for that 3-month period cutting down trees. There were a number of suspensions of the programme put in place by ourselves, by the police, by the authority. So, it was a very short period of time that reasonable force was actually in place.
Yeah.
So if you actually looked at the number of days or the number of weeks actually involved, things escalated very, very quickly during that period when reasonable force was introduced.
So I think those are all points that are well taken. But you don't disagree with Mr. Anderson's view with the benefit of hindsight, and I recognise hindsight's a great thing, but you're not disagreeing with the idea that not you necessarily, but the company could have been, should have been stronger in saying to the council, we just can't go on in this way.
With the benefit of hindsight, Mark, I'm sure we could have done that a lot sooner.
Okay, thank you very much. I want to ask if you would like to tell me anything else. You've been very open actually about some dimensions of this already, but if you'd like to tell me anything else about the personal impact on Amey's staff, people who you were supervising, and indeed the subcontractors of the dispute. You've been very clear, and others have been very clear, that your absolute top priority was health and safety, not just of your staff, but also of the campaigners, and that does come through in a lot of things I've seen. But nevertheless, I have quite a lot of evidence to the effect that there were harms that people suffered, and I wanted to ask you what more you'd like to tell me about that.
I think there were harms on all sides, to be honest. Yeah. I'll skip over that if I can.
That's fine.
Sorry,
you can take a minute if you want, but have a glass of water. Thank you very much.
Sorry.
And thank you very much. I understand. If there's anything subsequently you want to tell me about that, particular members of your staff, for example, or anything else you want to tell me, you can come back to me on that. But we'll move on.
Sorry, I saw the impact on campaigners every day.
Yes.
They're emotionally involved with the trees and
Yes.
trying to retain them at all cost, which I greatly admire. They were extremely respectful towards me and to my teams, but there were people on the fringes that weren't.
Yes.
And I think that's where people really got the abuse, the intimidation, not necessarily from the core campaigners.
Yes.
There's more people on the fringes. I think that's
Yes.
fair. And I think it was just all that, that social media. Everyone was filmed. I was filming the campaigners were filming me, the police was filming everybody. We had documentary makers who, again, were extremely polite and courteous on site. There was a lot of discussions with them on site, and they were very good. What you see on the film and necessarily what was happening as well on the street, sometimes it's chalk and cheese.
Yes.
There was quite often a lot of discussion on site about, will you let me take this tree because this one is dead, dying, diseased, but we'll leave that one. And through some of the suspensions, we were in huge dialogue with the campaigners about specific trees we needed to take out for health and safety reasons, and they were great. There was no resistance to any of those trees. We had to provide evidence of why those trees were coming out, and sometimes they did challenge me, to be fair, but overall it was good. There was a mutual respect.
Right. Okay. No, thank you. And look, I do have evidence of some things having been said and done to public officials and your staff who were basically doing their job, which are not to be condoned. And I'm looking carefully at that.
I think what I do take away, no one got harmed. It's a highly hazardous environment we're working in.
Yes.
No one was harmed.
Yes, I think it's a very interesting point actually. One of the benefits of multiple people filming the same event, one of the downsides is some people could present a particular version if they only used their films. But in fact, the fact that multiple people were filming the same thing actually acted as a bit of a restraint, it seems to me, on what at least some people.
I think, to be fair, I think the conduct of the arborists was fantastic. They work in a very hazardous environment, working aloft, and they were equally concerned about members of the public and the campaigners on the ground. And
Yes.
No one wants to hurt anybody.
Yes.
So, and to be fair to the security staff as well, reasonable force was a last resort. No one wanted to deliver or remove someone from the safety zones, and we didn't enjoy that period. No one enjoyed that period. Hence why I spend so much time on site trying to talk people out.
Yeah.
And again, you don't want to see people in court.
Yes. Yeah. No, thank you. Now, you are one of the people with the best understanding and knowledge of all these issues. So I wanted to ask you if you can help me understand really what are going to be good approaches into the future for some unresolved issues. I mean, firstly, there's the issue of roads and trees outstanding from the core investment period. What should the council and Amey be thinking about? It's not your job anymore.
No, it's not.
For those, let's start with that.
Yeah, I think for me, the introduction of the Street Tree Partnership was a fantastic outcome, if you like, to dispute. So, and through that partnership, through the stakeholders and everyone's involvement, there's a real opportunity for true consultation and collaboration. There are some really difficult decisions to be made. There are some difficult streets left and some difficult trees that need to be addressed. Whether that's we ignore them and just turn a blind eye to them, or we address the trees, the damage that they're causing to the infrastructure, and then address the canopy loss and all those sorts of impacts at the same time. And I think there's, through the partnership and through good consultation with residents and others, I think there's ways forward for all of them.
Right, so thank you for that. So basically the takeaway from that is it's really important to support the partnership in working through those issues and resource it adequately and so on.
Absolutely. There's a real commitment, I think, from Amey and the authority. I hope that commitment's still there. I'm sure it is, knowing the colleagues that are left. That the true answer to all this is through good collaboration with the stakeholders, right, and keeping everyone involved. And I'm proud of the fact that we introduced tree wardens and everything else. And through all those tools that we've got, now we can take the passion that the campaign led on, and hopefully, through the Street Tree Partnership and all the stakeholders working there, make sure we deliver, and keep trees, more prominent in the contract.
Very good, thank you. Now the next issue, sort of unresolved issue that needs to be thought about into the future, is whether there's anything that you think could arise as a result of further resurfacing or similar work due on the network into the future, because there's a substantial resurfacing game plan that is not the technical term obviously, but thing that's going to happen. I just wonder if there's anything there that you would advise people to think carefully about in the way they're handling it.
I think we're in a completely different place, like I say, with the partnership and everything else. And I think the engineering solutions, the lessons learned process we went through with the campaign, we spent an awful lot of time on the streets, looking at every individual tree, investigating alternatives to their replacement, and introducing, the thinner curbs, the flexi-pave, and everything as a result. And we worked really well and quite effectively, and had some skilled craftsmen on site delivering those solutions. So in the main, I'm not concerned. I think there are some difficult trees out there that still, but I think they're very small in number. And I think through that consultation, as I said, and involving the stakeholders, I think solutions can be identified. But I think it's got to have that investment in that partnership and make sure we deliver to the outcomes of that strategy that was put together.
Okay. Is there anything else that you think people should keep an eye on in terms of future risks that could emerge in the remaining 15 years of the contract?
It's difficult for me to say because I'm not truly involved now, but I think austerity is always going to be there. I think we're always there's going to be pressure to find efficiency savings in that project, but I don't see significant risks in relation to major disputes of the nature that we've had and campaigns. I think no one in the authority, and certainly no one in Amey, would want to ever go back to that, and I think everyone would work tremendously hard to ensure that we don't.
Yeah. Okay. I'm not sure I've given you enough time to talk about the benefits of the programme. I mean, you were responsible for supervising a substantial improvement of the road, pavement, street lighting network. Yeah. I wonder if you'd like to say anything about the benefits of having done that.
Yeah, I'm extremely proud of my time with Amey, with some regret, obviously, in certain aspects. But we have an extremely clean city. The cleansing standards we now operate to, or Amey operate to, is phenomenal. and they deliver a huge amount of work safely. And, you know, absolutely, Amey is committed to safety. It's committed to Sheffield. All the teams are Sheffield residents, if you like, as well. And you know, they delivered through the flooding, through harsh winters, and they do meet the performance requirements in the main. And I think they've invested significantly in the city, which obviously brings further development and everything else. So I'm extremely proud of what they did overall, and I do wish them all the very best. I think it's a great project.
Great. Okay, thank you very much. Is there anything else you'd like to say before we finish?
No, thank you.
Okay, thanks very much indeed. Charles, we can stop the hearing there. Thank you.